Hi everyone, thanks for joining and welcome to the webinar today, Exploring the Scope of Runaway and Homeless Youth Issues. I'm Rachel Reynolds, the Outreach and Prevention Specialist at NRS, and we're also joined here with some great panelists from National Network for Youth and Chapin Hall that I'll introduce in a bit. Just some housekeeping before we start. We'll have time at the end for everyone to ask the panelists some questions. But if there's any technical issues you're having, like right at this moment, I have Lee Ossichek, our Director of Training, Education, Prevention with me to answer anything urgent, so you can ask that in the chat or question box. And then also we're recording this webinar and we'll make it available to view and share after. So here's some items that you'll be able to walk away with after this webinar. One is to describe the history and importance of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, to discuss current research and trends on runaway and homeless youth issues, and then finally participate in National Runaway Prevention Month and take action throughout the year to support runaway and homeless youth. So I'm joined here with two other panelists today, and I'm going to give everyone a quick introduction and share some of their background, and then we can get started. So like I said, I'm Rachel. I'm the Outreach and Prevention Specialist at NRS. I manage the Let's Talk Runaway Prevention curriculum and other educational materials. I also lead in the planning and promotion of National Runaway Prevention Month. And I received my Master of Public Health with a concentration in community health from DePaul University in Chicago. And I have experience in research, evaluation, health promotion, and education. And then we're also joined here with Joanne Paanio, and she's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Network for Youth, with experiences in federal policy advocacy, equity-centered design, education, and direct legal services. So prior to joining the National Network for Youth, Joanne focused on government relations and capacity building strategies as policy manager of the Forum for Youth Investment, where she led a national campaign to increase pathways to education and employment for young people disconnected from school and work. And then today we're also joined with Dr. Matthew Morton, who's a research fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago with expertise in youth empowerment, homelessness, and evidence-based practice. He is the principal investigator of Voices of Youth Count, the most comprehensive national research initiative to date focused on youth homelessness in America. And Matt has held previous positions at the World Bank, the U.S. government, in philanthropy, and with youth-serving nonprofits. While working in the federal government, he was a key contributor to the development of the U.S. government's national strategy and framework to end youth homelessness. So welcome to both of you, and we're so excited to have them here today. First, we're going to hear from Joanne about the history of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the kind welcome and introduction. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Joanne Paanio, and I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Network for Youth. Our organization has been around for nearly 45 years. We are a membership-driven policy advocacy and public education organization comprised of over 300 service providers, local agencies, and young leaders with lived experience of homelessness. Turning now to this portion of today's presentation, I've been asked to share a brief overview and history of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act was enacted in 1974 during a time in our country where there was a great movement and momentum to deinstitutionalize status offenders. So as more and more folks, including policymakers, became aware of the fact that running away from home was an early indication that something was wrong at home for a young person, there was this incredible push by advocates and groups around the country to provide alternative means to detention. And instead of pushing and punishing youth away, there was this push to really figure out, well, how can we help and how can we redirect and target resources and programs? This was the first time that there was a prioritization and focus on the needs of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness through, again, targeted resources, programs, and direct services. What you see here on the slide in front of you is a great snapshot from our wonderful colleagues and friends at the Family, Youth, and Services Bureau's Runaway and Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center. Here you'll see an initial overview of the origins of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act also funds the 3 core programs that I'll go ahead and discuss on the following slide. So as I mentioned here, I'll go ahead and outline the 3 core programs that are funded and authorized by the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. The 3 core programs that are administered through grants by the Family, Youth and Services Bureau include Basic Center programs, street outreach programs, and transitional living programs, which also include maternity group homes. All 3 programs are outlined and designed with 3 of the following frameworks, including youth-centric focus systems, positive youth development, as well as trauma-informed care. Starting first with the Basic Center program. The Basic Center program was actually authorized in 1974 as part of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. The first 66 BCPs were funded in the following year in 1975. Basic Center programs allow community-based organizations to operate short-term emergency shelters for up to 21 days for youth up to the age of 18. Services at BCP, or drop-in centers, as they're also called, include food, clothing, and medical care, such as health and dental services, crisis intervention and counseling, both for the young person and for the family, as well as the goal of family reunification when safe and stable for the young person. As we had discussed in the prior slide, BCPs incorporate those frameworks and elements of positive youth development and trauma-informed care. Aftercare services upon exit through Basic Center programs include everything from post-family reunification to individual counseling, case management, and housing references. I'd like to point out that as of fiscal year 2016, more than 31,000 youth have entered the doors of Basic Center programs. Going to the next slide, please. What you see here is an overview and snapshot from our friends at the Family, Youth and Services Bureau, which outlines and highlights the demographic breakdown of adolescents and young adults that enter the doors of Basic Center programs. While I won't read each of the details that you see here in front of you, it is important to note that 4 out of 5 youth are coming from the home of a parent, guardian, relative, or friend, and fewer than 1 in 10 have been living on the street. Young people are often connected to BCPs by word of mouth, through friends and peers, by calling in, as well as referrals. About 31,000 young people are able to and have become connected to shelters and services per year, and approximately 71,000 youth, adults, practitioners, and other professionals look to BCPs for advice and support. These figures were collected and drawn from the Runaway and Homeless Youth Management Information System. And if you're interested in finding out more on BCPs and some of this demographic information, you can go ahead and visit the link that you see to the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Transitional Living Program. Congress created Transitional Living Programs, in other words, TLPs, for older homeless youth in 1988. This is included as part of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Long-term services through residential services for young people between the ages of 16 through 22 for up to 18 months or longer under extenuating circumstances are offered through transitional living programs. And these essentially were developed with the goal of providing a safety net and strong emotional support system to caring adults for young people in order to transition into independence and self-sufficiency. Extended residential shelters include group homes, maternity group homes, host family homes, and supervised apartments. Support services include life skills and life skills building, including everything from how to cook, how to read and sign a lease, and how to manage a savings account. Mental and physical care services are also provided, as well as education and advancement, such as higher education, workforce training, and job attainment. As of 2016, TLPs have changed the lives of more than 5,000 homeless youth. I also wanted to point out that for maternity group homes, young parents and families are offered services including parenting skills, child care, child nutrition services, as well as pre- and postnatal care. And for an example of such parenting topics in a curriculum, everything from nutrition to safety, child development, family learning, health, child care, emotional support, stress reduction, as well as family engagement strategies are offered. Moving on to the next slide. Again, providing a snapshot and overview of the young person that typically enters the doors of a transitional living program. So in this profile, you'll see that 35% of youth and young adults are living on the streets or in a shelter, whereas 28% are couch surfing, living at the home of friends or relatives. Next slide, please. Finally, our street outreach programs. Street outreach programs provide street-based outreach and services for youth who have been subjected to or at risk of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, prostitution, and trafficking, where there is a focus on creating and establishing relationships and trust between outreach workers and young people. Services include education and outreach, access and connections to emergency shelters, survival aid, treatment and counseling, crisis intervention, as well as follow-up support services. The Family, Youth, and Services Bureau has been funding and guiding the work of street outreach programs since 1996. Strong connections between youth homelessness and human trafficking have been found in recent studies, as youth and young adults have turned to survival sex for the purposes of being able to meet their basic needs, such as housing, food, safety, security, and financial stability. And with this, I'd like to go ahead and turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Joanne. I also just wanted to briefly mention that everyone saw that we had the fact sheets on the pages. Just to learn more about the FSBE-funded core services, you can check them out on their website with the link below, and we'll also send up a follow-up email with links to those as well. So now I'm just going to share a little bit about NRS. We're part of the FSBE RHY programs, and we are the federally designated national communication system for runaway and homeless youth. Our mission is to keep America's runaway, homeless, and at-risk youth safe and off the streets. And each year we make approximately 100,000 connections with youth and families through a hotline, online, and offline resources, which I'll cover over the next few slides. So at NRS, we offer trauma-informed, solution-focused crisis intervention through our hotline number, which is 1-800-RUNAWAY, and also through our website, 1-800-RUNAWAY.org, to youth, service providers, and parents. At NRS, we provide support information, and we have a large database that we're constantly updating in order to provide referrals. So currently, we have over 6,000 resources in our database, and this can include housing, substance abuse treatment, counseling, and a variety of different things. Through our hotline, we offer a messaging service and provide conference calls as an option for communication. So the messaging service can be used as a first line of communication between youth and families. They can leave a message for one another as a way to really begin and start communication. So it kind of looks like a young person can call, safely call and leave a message with NRS, and then we can deliver it to their parent or guardian. And then next, conference calls are another service that we provide. They're youth initiated, and there are two things that they can be used for. So one is to help link youth to services. This way we can be an advocate for the youth calling and empower them. So for an example, if youth needs housing, we can call with them to make sure that they meet the shelter's requirements. And the second use of a conference call is where NRS can mediate a conversation with the youth and their legal guardian. And this can be done that the youth is left home and they're calling, or that they're still at home and they need some help having this conversation mediated. Home Free is another service that's made available by NRS, and it's in partnership with Greyhound, and it can grant free bus tickets to youth that have left home but wish to return home. And then finally, we also offer our online services. This includes texting, live chat, and crisis forum and email. We also have promotional materials and free educational resources that can be found on our website, which I'll go into a little more detail in the next two slides. So here at NRS, we're in a really unique position to tackle runaway prevention because over 50% of the youth that are contacting us are still at home and not yet on the streets. So youth are reaching out to us before they've left home, which really means runaway episodes and time on the street can be prevented. We do this with the services that I just mentioned, like connecting youth to resources, problem solving with them, and also being a listening ear when they're in need. And then we also have community awareness, education, and prevention strategies. So we post educational blogs on our website that highlight issues that runaway and homeless youth face, and also the resources that are available to them. And then every November, we lead the National Runaway Prevention Month campaign, which I'll go into details later in this webinar. And then finally, we have our Let's Talk Runaway Prevention curriculum. This can be downloaded on our website. It's free and it's available in both Spanish and English. The goals are to help youth develop and build different life skills, to educate them about the alternatives to running away, and then also encourage youth to seek help from a trusted adult and increase their knowledge about runaway resources and prevention. The curriculum is 14 modules with a variety of different topics. An example of just some of these topics are communication and listening, stress reduction, and anger management. And we also see this being used and implemented in a variety of different settings, and it's very user-friendly. So now I am going to turn it over to Matthew and Joanne to discuss current research on runaway and homeless youth.
Great, thanks so much. Hi everybody, my name is Matt Morton. I'm a research fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. We focus on research around vulnerable children, youth, and family issues. I'm based in New York City myself. And so I'm sort of the nerd on the call today here, or one of the nerds that give you a sense of what we know about youth homelessness at the national level. But this work started personally for me. I was a youth that grew up with a lot of turmoil at home and lost my parents at an early age and ran away on multiple occasions. But I was a lucky one because a teacher and then the right programs in my community really came in at the right time for me and changed my trajectory. But many young people, including some of my siblings, have not been so lucky and they remain invisible. And I'm excited about research and data because good evidence, good data can help make the invisible visible. They can shed light on our blind spots as a nation and as service providers, as community members, so that we can make more informed decisions about how we make a difference in preventing and ending youth homelessness overall. So that inspires the work that we've taken on. At Chapin Hall, we have an initiative called Voices of Youth Count. It's a mixed methods research project, involves different types of research expertise on our team and policy expertise. It's a public-private partnership that has involved support from the federal government, as well as from private family foundations. And it's the most comprehensive research initiative on youth homelessness to date in the United States. And so we're really excited to share some of what we've learned from this work so far with you. Next slide. Before I go into the findings, though, I just want to let you know that this work is a partnership not only among different funders and national organizations like National Safeline, but also with 22 communities across the country that have been partners in this work and helping us collect data, collaborate with youth with lived experience. And in 5 of these communities, we went in even deeper and did in-depth qualitative work to understand young people's stories, how they came into homelessness, and their pathways. And in all 22 communities, we did collaborative youth counts of youth experiencing homelessness to document the extent of the need, as well as surveys of service providers and continuums of care to understand what the service or the supply side looks like in those same 22 communities. Next slide. All of our work is really informed by a youth-centric approach. So why would we look at youth homelessness? Why not just homelessness overall? It's not that youth or homelessness is unique to youth, of course, and it's not about a contest, between youth and adult homelessness. Both are parts of a bigger crisis that warrant immediate action in our country. But there are specific considerations when we think about youth homelessness, which is what motivated this focus of our research. First, we know that adolescence and young adulthood are critical developmental periods. We often think about the first 1,000 days in early childhood, but the brain goes through massive reorganization during adolescence and young adulthood up to about age 25. And what happens during that period can significantly shape young people's trajectories for better or for worse throughout their lives. And if what's happening during that period is housing instability and trauma and adversity, that is going to really impair their ability to realize their full potential and be active members of our society. Second is that youth homelessness tends to be especially hidden. I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but young people in particular don't usually fit that mold of the older chronically homeless adult that a lot of people think about and imagine when they think of homelessness as somebody who's always sitting on that same street corner. It's often young people in and out of homelessness over time, and it is young people who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability across different sleeping arrangements, from sleeping on the street to in a car to on a bus to couch surfing or doubling up with others because they don't have a safe and stable place to stay. All of this makes youth homelessness a lot harder to identify and a lot harder to estimate. Also, we've learned from increasing research that youth homelessness is the single greatest pathway into adult homelessness. It's not eviction, it's not domestic violence, it's not a mental health or substance abuse problem. The most common pathway that people have into adult homelessness is experiencing homelessness and housing instability as youth. So if we care about the homelessness crisis overall, we have to address youth homelessness to get ahead of it. And then finally, the policy levers are different. Think schools, think child welfare systems, think after school programs. We just have different entry points for engaging on youth homelessness that we don't necessarily have in adult and family homelessness in the same way. Next slide. All of our resources are publicly available. So rather than put out one big 400-page report and call it a day, we have learned so much, and every couple of months we put out a new, what we call research to impact brief, which is kind of a bite-sized piece. It's a smaller report on different subtopics around youth homelessness, ranging from national estimates to rural homelessness to LGBTQ youth issues to pregnant parenting youth. So all of these, as we produce them, we put them on voicesofyouthcount.org, or you can get them on Chapin Hall's website. Everything is free and available to you to start a conversation in your community about this issue, and we hope that you will. We have two coming out over the next month. One is on the evidence of programs and practices for youth homelessness, and another brief that's coming out on the intersections of education and youth homelessness. Next slide. So now I'm going to share at a high level what we've learned to try to give you some insights based on the research so far. First is at a high level based on the first nationally representative survey of youth homelessness ever done. We found that youth homelessness is indeed a broad and hidden challenge. 1 in 30 adolescents ages 13 to 17 experience some form of homelessness within a 12-month period. And with young adults, the prevalence rate climbed even higher to almost 1 in 10 young adults experiencing some form of homelessness within a year. About half of those experiences were youth who reported couch surfing without a safe and stable place to stay, and underscores the extent to which this problem involves a lot of different arrangements and hidden challenges. The other thing that we were able to examine that previous studies weren't in the same way was prevalence comparisons between rural and urban communities. And at a high level, what we found was that youth homelessness is just as prevalent in rural communities as it is in urban communities. Statistically, the prevalence rates were virtually equal, which goes to show that youth homelessness is not an East Coast, West Coast problem. It's not an inner city problem. It really is a national challenge. Now, there are more youth experiencing homelessness in urban communities because there are more human beings who live in urban communities. But as a share of the population, it is just as much of a challenge in rural America. However, as the next slide shows, just because the prevalence of youth homelessness is similar between rural and urban America doesn't mean it looks the same. And in fact, what we found is that youth homelessness in smaller, more rural communities was more hidden, more dispersed, as you might expect. So youth in smaller communities, more rural communities, were about half as likely to be staying in shelters as youth in larger urban communities, which makes sense because often youth shelters don't even exist in those areas. And they were twice as likely to be found staying with others, couch surfing, doubling up. And so this goes to show the extent to which you need just different and more rural sensitive outreach and identification strategies for this issue in rural communities. Next slide. We also find that not all youth experience homelessness at equal rates, and this also contributes to the invisibility of the issue. Some youth are far more likely to experience homelessness and have higher prevalence rates that skew the average. For example, youth of color and LGBTQ identifying young people, pregnant and parenting youth, all have much higher rates of homelessness than white, non-Hispanic, and non-parenting youth, for instance. The single risk correlate that we found, or the single characteristic that we found that was associated with the highest risk for homelessness among young people was the lack of a high school education. Those youth had 4.5 times the risk of experiencing homelessness as youth who had at least a high school diploma. So this underscores the interconnection between early school leaving or school dropout and homelessness. Next slide. We also find that the intersection of different risk identities is really important. So if you were a Black young person, for example, who identified as heterosexual, you had about twice the rate of a white heterosexual young person experiencing homelessness. Same thing for a white youth who was identifying as LGBTQ. But if you identified as both Black and LGBTQ, you had about 4 times the rate of homelessness as white, cisgender, heterosexual young people. So the intersectionality of different risk identities is really important to understand as we figure out how we provide affirming services and supports in communities where young people are most at risk. Next slide. Not only are LGBTQ young people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer young people at higher risk for experiencing homelessness, but among those youth who experience homelessness, youth who identify as LGBTQ report even higher rates of trauma and adversities. And so you can see that here, for example, much higher rates of having been exposed to forced sex, of having had to exchange sex for basic needs, of having been exposed to discrimination or stigma, both within and outside of the family. To be clear, these rates of adversity are much too high for all young people and cause for concern. But the fact that they are even so much higher for LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness helps us understand why young people say that they need safe and affirming spaces if they're going to engage with services, because they have such a significant history of experience with discrimination and trauma. Next slide. We also find that there are blurry lines between youth and family homelessness. Often we kind of think of these as two very different things. But 44% of young adult women experiencing homelessness who would be considered youth were themselves pregnant or parenting. So we really have a significant overlap. The problem here is that youth and family homelessness systems and services often don't speak well to one another. They don't coordinate well with one another. But we need holistic systems. We need holistic services that address the developmental needs of a youth that is 19 or 20 years old, as well as their needs of the child that might be a year or an infant or 2 years old, as well as the holistic needs of a family. And so this is really important when we think about appropriate service delivery models. Next slide. And then this slide demonstrates our analysis from administrative data from a lot of homelessness systems across the country. And basically what we're finding, among lots of other things, is that among the few young people, among the youth who come into homelessness systems, only about 1/3 of them ever get HUD funding housing resources, even once they're brought into these systems and go through the intake process. And among those few youth who get these housing resources like supportive housing or housing subsidies, they have to wait for a long time, about 4.5 months on average, many of them even longer. And not only are they waiting, but those waits seem to be associated with harm, and that every additional day of waiting for a housing placement was associated with a 2% decrease and a youth's likelihood of staying stably housed even after they made it into that housing program. So the longer that young people have to wait for resources, the less likely they are to succeed, because they're acquiring more trauma and adversity as they're staying in shelters or on the streets or couch surfing. So this means that we need more resources, more housing resources, so that young people don't have to endure these waits and more youth can access services. But they also mean we need to prevent more young people from coming into these underfunded homelessness systems in the first place. Next slide. So to the prevention angle, I just want to highlight a few things that we've learned about young people's pathways into homelessness. Next slide. First and foremost is just kind of a qualitative point that's just emerged over and over again from the in-depth interviews that we did with young people. And that is that for youth, homelessness is about more than the loss of housing. We think of this as just a housing problem, about a roof over the head. But it's so much more when you listen to their stories about the lack or the loss of relationships and connections over time that they relied on, or should be relying on, for love and support and housing stability. And this housing instability that they're facing, the homelessness that they're experiencing, is just one factor among many that characterize their journeys. Most young people's journeys were characterized by a lot of adversity, but also resilience. And every journey is unique, and it's really important to center young people, their voices, and that we're listening to youth themselves and working with them so that we're building out systems that respond to the diversity of their experiences. Next slide. When we look at the young people that we had interviewed in depth, we learned a lot about them. While their stories were all very unique, there are a couple of high-level points that I want to highlight that were fairly common. One is that most young adults experiencing homelessness had started to experience homelessness or housing instability well into their adolescence, if not their childhood. And so there are many missed opportunities early in their trajectories to engage that we're not engaging in. The other is that 1 in 4 young adults experiencing unaccompanied homelessness first experience family homelessness. So again, looking at this intersection between youth and family homelessness, where if we can intervene more on one side, it can also benefit the other as well. And so we need this cross-system thinking. Next slide. And speaking of systems, we know that young people who have been involved in certain systems have a higher risk for homelessness. So among the youth in the 22 counties where we surveyed them on a point in time about their homelessness experiences, 29% had ever been in foster care, and that's compared to only 2% of the general youth population. It's pretty astounding. Additionally, nearly half of youth experiencing homelessness had ever been in detention, prison, or jail. And that's not even counting other contacts or arrests with the juvenile or criminal justice system. Again, much higher than what we see in the general youth population. And as I mentioned before, the lack of a high school diploma or dropping out of school is a major risk factor for experiencing homelessness. So here are 3 systems alone that could be engaged in a much deeper way with homelessness services and systems to prevent and address youth homelessness, either before it happens or much earlier in young people's trajectories. And young people would benefit from that early intervention, and we could all spend less public costs if we intervene earlier. Next slide. So we think this calls for a rethink of our approach. You can go to the next slide. Overall, when we think of homelessness response, we often think of crisis or triage. And this is the same kind of model or paradigm that emerged in World War I, where you had too many bloody bodies on the battlefield and you had to figure out who you helped first. And you have to triage, so it's important that we do that. At the same time, having a triage crisis response as the whole of your healthcare, or as the whole of your homelessness response, is like treating an emergency room as the whole of a healthcare system. It just wouldn't make sense. So on the next slide, what we really champion is, yes, strengthen the crisis response center around young people. Listen to young people closely. collaborate with young people with lived experience to build a better crisis response system so that homelessness is brief. But at the same time, we also need a fuller perspective. We need better systems and services in our communities, which also involve prevention on the front end and stable housing on the back end. And when you think about these prevention and stable housing ends of the spectrum, this suggests much more need for engagement of all of us in the community, whether we're mentors or faith-based organizations or schools or juvenile justice systems. These broader systems and organizations in a community are really front and center when it comes to prevention and helping young people sustainably exit homelessness for good. Next slide. The other thing I just want to highlight is that the federal government and framework around youth homelessness suggests these 4 core outcome areas for youth homelessness: stable housing, permanent connections, education and employment, social emotional well-being. And now we have common outcome measures that we encourage community-based organizations and systems to use. So we've created a resource based on a lot of feedback from the field and from young people around common outcome measures so that organizations have apples to apples to work with. And so if you're a service providing organization and are interested in doing more work around capturing and monitoring outcomes at the youth level, we really encourage you to check out this resource. And next slide. And so that's it from my end.
Thanks so much, Matt. Now we're going to hear from Joanne about public perception.
Great, thank you. As Rachel mentioned, so in this portion of the presentation, we're going to go ahead and switch gears to examine public perceptions and the way that members of the public understand the scope of youth homelessness in America. Next slide, please. So in February of 2019, we at the National Network for Youth partnered with Ipsos and polled over 1,000 adults above the age of 18 on issues related to youth homelessness. For folks who may not be familiar with the work of Ipsos, they are an independent market research company that was founded in 1975 and now operates worldwide. And a little bit more about the poll before we go ahead and dive on deep into some of the data that we found. The poll was conducted online through a survey of adults who are over the age of 18 from the continental US, including the states of Alaska and Hawaii, and questions were asked in English. And what we found according to the survey was that those polled generally underestimated the numbers of homeless youth and found that between the ages of 18 to 25, only 13% of those polled correctly answered with an estimate between 3 to 4 million. Given that only 13% estimated correctly, I think this uplifts and highlights points that my colleague Matt had mentioned earlier with the hidden nature of youth homelessness and how the population of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness often is an invisible population, with folks not understanding the different ways that youth and young adults are experiencing homelessness and the fluidity of such, from couch surfing to doubling up and going in and out of shelters. Just to give you a general understanding of the numbers for this question, 48% estimated numbers that were lower than 3 to 4 million, and then 14% of those polled actually overestimated the numbers of 3 to 4 million. 91% of those who were polled believe that dealing with the problem of youth homelessness is important, so they found that this issue was crucial. 88% agreed that the success of young Americans has a direct impact on the success of their overall communities. Americans also seem disconnected on problems that young homeless people face, as only 39% agreed that couch surfing is a form of homelessness. Then further questions overwhelmingly told us and revealed that approximately 80% believe that the federal and state governments in our country should prioritize reducing youth homelessness. And lastly, about 80% also agreed that the government should prioritize funding for programs and services that help young people who are homeless complete high school and find a job. Going on to the next slide, please. So for those of us who are deeply involved in this work and understand both the data as well as the consequences of what happens when fewer and fewer youth and young adults are connected to the appropriate youth-centric services and programs, we understand that what we need, one of the solutions that we need, is an reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Here on the slide, you'll have different ways that you can take action. The last full programmatic reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act took place in 2008. If you're interested in learning more about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, you can go ahead and visit our website, which will be available towards the end of the presentation. It's a critical time, again, as the last programmatic reauthorization took place in 2008, and currently government expenditures are about $30 per young person per year, which shows the federal government how much they're currently spending to address and end youth homelessness around the country. Ways for folks to get involved on this issue and on this piece of legislation is to contact your U.S. House representative as well as your U.S. senators to support the reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. On our website, you'll also find other helpful information on different ways to engage with your congressional leaders on both the House and the Senate. And then lastly, educating others through your networks and sharing what you learned today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Joanne. So now I'm going to share with everyone just some additional ways to get involved and ways to support runaway and homeless youth. So like I mentioned earlier, one way to get involved and participate is in National Runaway Prevention Month, or also we call it NRPM. And this is an annual awareness and prevention campaign that's focused on runaway and homeless youth issues. So it happens every November, and participants across the country host activities and events that highlight experiences of runaway and homeless youth and how individuals and organizations can play a role in ending youth homelessness. So NRPM highlights available resources and assists communities in creating a stronger safety net for at-risk and homeless youth. And the goals of the campaign are twofold. So one is to raise awareness of the runaway and homeless youth crisis and the issues that these young people face. And then the second is to educate the public about solutions and the role that they can play in runaway prevention and ending youth homelessness. So these next two slides are NRPM national events. These events are also listed on our website, 1-800-runaway.org/NRPM. And on our page, there's also different NRPM resources like our toolkit, messaging guide, and things of that nature. So we kick off NRPM on November 1st with Profile Picture Day. You can add the Shine a Light filter to your Facebook profile so you can show your support of runaway and homeless youth for the entire month of November. And then the week of November 4th through 8th is Education Week. And during this week, we'll be sharing information about RHY issues, like providing current statistics, exploring what RHY means and what it can look like for different individuals, discussing challenges of navigating different systems. I know a lot of our partners too are planning to share really great information during this time as well. And we'll be doing this through our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. And then during Education Week, we'll also be hosting a Twitter chat on Tuesday, November 5th. And this is where different organizations and individuals can engage in a discussion about runaway and homeless youth. And there's written instructions on how to join on our website, but you can also follow along using the hashtag NRPM chat and search that on Twitter. And then Tuesday, November 12th is Wear Green Day. And this is a really easy and fun way to get involved in NRPM and raise awareness. So you can dress maybe with your organization and at the office. And for some added impact, we ask that individuals and groups post their pictures to social media and use the hashtag NRPM 2019 so we can interact with you that way and repost and see what everyone's doing in support. And then finally is Light the Night community events on Tuesday, November 19th. And this is where youth service agencies, community groups, and individuals across the country will be hosting events to shine a light on the issues and show solidarity with youth in crisis. So we've seen organizations using flashlights, candles, and other forms of light. We're also hosting events such as resource fairs or a sleep out. And then now I'm going to move on to share the call to action document that we created with the National Network for Youth on ways to get involved on different levels. So by taking national, regional, organizational, and individual action. This document we'll send out after and will be available on our website. And it starts with the national action of contacting legislators to support RHYA, so a little bit of what Joanne was just speaking to. And in this document, we give links to find local representatives and sample outreach letters. The regional action is to connect with the local campaign to end youth homelessness, and also how to connect and link with coalition and stakeholder groups. And another way is connect with your local RHY provider, and this document links FISB's RHY grantees and how to search for them through their website. And then moving on to the organizational action, one way is to use the NRPM toolkit that I briefly mentioned to plan events with your organization, sponsor an awareness event or a panel presentation. And also another way is to invite community members and officials to tour your organization and get the word out that way. And then lastly, at the individual action level, you can share your strengths by either donating your time, money or materials, or teaching a class at a youth shelter or organization that serves young people. We've linked ways to search for volunteer opportunities on this document as well. So yeah, if anyone has any questions about NRPM or the call to action, please feel free to reach out and we can talk about ways to collaborate. But I just wanted to thank everyone so much for tuning in and learning about the RHYA, the core runaway and homeless youth programs, current research, and then ways to get involved and support runaway and homeless youth. And a huge shout out to Joanne and Matt. Thank you so much for sharing all this really valuable information. Now we're going to open the floor to some questions. You can type them into the question box, and we'll have Lee, who's joined with me, read them out loud and answer your questions that way. So thank you again. So yeah, you can either raise your hand or type in a question. We'll be sticking around a little, so please feel free to ask anything.